Okay, good morning, everyone. I think it's time to get started. So, I started the recording of this session, so it is being recorded, and we'll get started with our panel discussion. First of all, thanks everyone for joining us this morning for the discussion on techniques for coping with the impact of COVID-19 on problem solving, collective bargaining, and mediation. We're really looking forward to sharing some examples from the US and from abroad and hearing your feedback during the discussion. I'm Sarah Morgan. I am the Senior Government Relations Officer in the International Labor Organization's Office for the United States and Canada. I will help guide the discussion a bit today. It's really interesting to be here today to talk about these tools because at the ILO, we're right in the middle of the first International Labor Conference being held virtually. So I think we've all had a lot of experience over the past year or so in using these new mediums and lessons learned to share. Before we get started with the panel discussion, just a couple of logistical notes. One, we'll go through a series of comments with today's speakers today, and then we'll try and leave some time at the end for questions and answers. But feel free throughout the time to type questions in the chat as we go, and we'll try and cover those as we can. Also, as I noted, the session is being recorded and will be available on the LARA conference page afterwards. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to our speakers to give a little bit of background of themselves, a brief introduction, and then we'll get into questions. Kevin, can I start with you?
Make sure I was unmuted. Welcome. My name is Kevin Wagner. I'm a federal mediator. FMCS, which is the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. I'm based out of the headquarters in Washington, D.C. The reason I'm on the panel is because I've been working remotely since the middle of March of last year. So everything I've done has been online. And before I came to FMCS, I worked for the Air Traffic Controllers Union, that's NATCA, in Washington, D.C., in their Labor Relations Department. I worked for a labor arbitrator in Northern Virginia who did private and sector arbitrations, EEO investigations, fact findings, and family mediation. And then I worked for Bloomberg BNA, which is based in Arlington, Virginia. They're the folks that cover the federal government. I didn't do that. I did labor relations for them. I worked for them for 17 years, 10 of which I was the director of labor relations. And then I came to FMCS in December of 2018. And I'm also the first third generation federal mediator. My father was a federal mediator at FMCS. My grandfather was a federal mediator at FMCS. And my other grandfather was a director of labor relations at a company in New Jersey. So I have been around labor relations my entire life and mediation, and I really enjoy what I do.
Thanks, Kevin. Born into it. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Antoinette, can I ask you next?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. My name is Commissioner Antoinette Turner. I am a federal mediator with FMCS as well, with my colleague Kevin Wagner, in the headquarters office in Washington, D.C. as well. I've been with FMCS now 4 years. I came in 2017, and prior to coming to FMCS, I was with SEIU, Labor Union, with 1199 local union, with them for 13 years. I was one of the vice presidents. My area was the Baltimore, Maryland, DC metropolitan area. And I was the vice president there. And prior to being with SEIU, I was with AFSCME. So my background has been in the labor world for 20 plus years. Absolutely loving being a mediator now and being with FMCS as a neutral. Absolutely love it. As Kevin said, we've been working virtually now for over a year, working on various different platforms, being trained continuously on new techniques that's continuously coming about, and absolutely loving it. So hopefully you all will enjoy some of the things you hear today, and hopefully have some good questions for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Antoinette. And last, but certainly not least, Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Actually, good afternoon from me. I'm actually joining from just outside of Geneva, Switzerland, which is where I'm based, working for the International Labour Organization. So my name's Chris Land-Kazlauskas. I've been with the ILO now for just over 20 years, both here in headquarters and with a number of field assignments in Trinidad and Tobago earlier in my career, and more recently running a project on freedom of association and social dialogue in Myanmar between 2014 and 2016. I lead up right now, I head up the labor relations and collective bargaining team here in headquarters, and we have a number of specialists in our decent work teams all across the field. And yeah, I mean, throughout my career, I've been, my titles had some iteration of sort of labor relations, industrial relations, collective bargaining, dialogue, something in there. And it's a real pleasure to be here with everybody and share a little bit of experience from the international level.
Great, thanks, Chris. I'm really excited for this panel because I think it will be rich with examples and practical advice on what we've learned over the last year. So that's great. And to that end, I'd like to start, Kevin, with you to just talk a little bit about the process itself and the changes. You know, we have Ring Central, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, telephone, a variety of internet and electronic platforms. How has the past year and the pandemic and working remotely changed the negotiations and dispute resolution in practice?
Well, it's changed it a lot, but in some ways it's the same. So, and I would say that if I can do virtual mediation, anyone can do it, because I'm not an IT specialist by any means. But you know, before the pandemic, I'd never done a virtual mediation of any kind, whether it's collective bargaining or employment mediation or EEO or training or all the things we do. Had never done any of it virtually. You were just kind of thrown in the deep end and asked to do it. And I can tell you at the very, very beginning, in the middle of March, I would say that parties were very hesitant, whether it was labor or management. It wasn't really one or the other. In the beginning, they were very hesitant to do virtual. For some reason, they thought it wasn't respectful of, you know, the respect they deserved. They should be in person, because let's say that that's what they had agreed to, but that was prior to the pandemic, which is a different thing. And as you mentioned, you know, over the last year, FMCS uses Ring Central, which is a Zoom product. There's Zoom, done mediations with that, collective bargaining, done Microsoft Teams, done things completely over the telephone, which is a challenge, and we'll get to that. We're going to probably transition to Zoom Government, which is another platform. I was just on, I think it's Google Meetings. I can't keep track of all of them, but I would say the most important thing is to, you know, get the parties to understand that this is different and acknowledge it from the beginning, which is it's different, to be patient and to just trust the process. And that it's still negotiating, it's still mediating, it's still the same thing that you're doing, you're just doing it remotely. And so what do you have to do? I think with any of these platforms, well, first of all, you have to get an agreement on which platform to use, which sounds really simple, but you need to find out if you're working with a federal agency, do they allow Ring Central to be downloaded, or is it being blocked? Are you more comfortable with this platform or that platform? And then get the main people that together that are in the negotiations and do a demo. So for the last year, I could probably say there's been at least 6 demos a month, every single month, just to get, you know, if you're working through, doesn't matter what type of mediation, doesn't matter if it's collective bargaining or not, to get everybody on and to get them comfortable and let them just feel how it works. So I get them on, let them ask a lot of questions, make sure they learn how to get their mute on and off, how to show them how to put them into caucuses, you know, into separate meetings, and say, hey, this is what happens, and just show them. And it's usually, the meetings are maybe 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. And by the end of that hour, I'd say 99% of the time they're okay with it. And then once you actually get through the first meeting, everyone's tends to be okay with it. They're fine with it. They understand that it's a little different. You acknowledge there's going to be interruptions. You acknowledge there's going to be dogs barking and kids barking in the room and cicadas buzzing and all that sort of thing, and just say, we're going to roll with it. We're going to be patient. I can tell you a couple things. One is that caucuses or separate meetings within negotiations, they're much more, let's just say, efficient, because in the real world, prior to COVID, if you were meeting in person and you had to get people into caucuses, it was like herding cats. You have to get them down there, make sure they're in the right room, make sure everybody's in the right spot. And then closing caucuses, it's like, someone's got to get coffee, they're on another call, they got to go to the bathroom. When you're in a virtual platform, it's bam, we're closing the rooms, you let everybody know what's going on, you close them, and then 1 minute later, they're back in the joint session. So that really speeds up the process. In my experience, I think people tend to be more polite, maybe because I asked them to be at the beginning, and also because they're also forced to be more polite, because if you have more than one person speaking, it cancels everything out, and they learn very quickly they can't have a back and forth. They have to take their time and actually listen. And I found that's been helpful in the process. And they tend to get to the point more often because they're just sitting at home, they're looking at their screen, they're doing their thing. There's not a lot of other distractions. So they do tend to try to get to the point a little bit more quickly, I'd say. But I can tell you that Zoom fatigue is real, and we learned this on our own way back in March of last year, where we kind of stumbled on this, and we learned that, normally you'd say, oh, we're going to bargain from 9 to 5 or 9 to 7 or as long as it takes and all that sort of thing. And after the first week, both sides and I had seen the same thing. I said, 2 to 3 hours max at a time. Anything after that, it loses steam and people just turn into zombies. So I've learned that, and every negotiation I've done, they've learned that on their own. And there hasn't been this need to just pack the hours in to do it, because like I said, it's more efficient, and they can share information with a platform like this and share the document, and it's instantaneous. They're not going to a copy room and printing it all out and doing that sort of thing. So in some ways it's quicker, but in some ways you can't read people as well. You can't see what their reactions are. And you're not used to looking at yourself. You're not looking, you can't really, if there's 30 people on the screen, you're looking all around and seeing who's paying attention, who's doing what. But if you're patient, you do put the prep time in, do a demo, that half hour to an hour goes a long way to having a smooth process. So that's what I'd say I've learned over the last year.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Antoinette, I know also working for FMCS, you probably have some similar experiences, but anything to add on the technology itself? Like what have been some of the biggest questions that you've gotten just on, besides how to mute and unmute, which is my biggest challenge still?
Some of the questions were, can anybody else come in while we're here? And we tell them, no, the mediators, we're controlling this. They want to know, so trust, they go into the trust part of it. They want to make sure that people are not recording, because we can't see what everybody is doing. So we just try to make them understand that because the mediator has the control of the features, that if, no one else can control it. So no, you won't have to worry about nobody else recording. You won't, if you don't see the red light, then it's not recording. As Kevin indicated, when you go through the trainings, we always would take them through not just a test run, but also try to take them through a training, because we also have technical, our mediator tech department, and they would also come on and help us where we may not know all the technical aspects of it. We always would have one of the technical mediators that will come on and assist us with the parties. And any of the questions that Kevin and I may not know how to answer, our technical parties definitely could answer those questions for them and help them feel more comfortable and walk them through that process as well to help them understand the process, feel more comfortable, so that we can concentrate on the mediation portion of it.
Which is, of course, the most important part, but that's good. Chris, what about internationally? Are you using the same platforms? As you have some of the same experiences as Kevin and Antoinette?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have had a lot of similar experiences. The platforms are more or less exactly the same. I used one called Blue Jeans early on. We tended to jump around in the beginning because I think there was a lot of concern about the security of different platforms. So that was something where early on we were not really sure that Zoom was the place to go, but that seems to be more and more kind of the go-to. One thing that was interesting internationally is I expected this sort of technical or bandwidth issues to be much more of an issue in the global south, and it turned out not to be in the end. In fact, I don't know, earlier on, it was either my connection here in Geneva or Kevin's in DC. It was a little bit jumpy. I mean, the laggy and the jumpy kind of connections and things happen just as much in the global north as it does in the global south. I agree totally. I had notes here that said, 2 to 3 hours is basically the max of what you can do. So you end up breaking up negotiations over much, much longer periods of time than you would normally do. It ends up going into weeks and months rather than having something that you can knock out in maybe a week or 2 weeks. Although to say that, you lose people, it's absolutely true in general. Although I have to say, I've recognized there are some like Zoom superheroes, superwomen, supermen who somehow have the stamina to keep going. And sometimes you can actually rely on that as long as you have someone on both sides that's, helping to kind of drive the thing. They can inject a little bit more energy and things into the session. I had a bit of a different experience with breakout groups. I found them to be possible. And it is true that you can set the timer and you can, force everybody out of the group back into the plenary. But I also found it was very difficult to kind of manage the time there. I would regularly go and check in and have people say, we still need 15, 20 more minutes. And a lot of the early parts of it were set just trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to actually hold this discussion? How are we actually going to take these notes? Who's going to be reporting back, etc. So I think that, the technology is there, but it was really hard to kind of encourage participation. And this happened both in some negotiation facilitation work that I was doing, as well as in a lot of the trainings that we had going on. We had like whiteboards that we put at people's disposal, but it really took time for people to get used to that and how to make best use of that. And I think the other thing that I would just mention is absolutely what was said earlier. Body language is very, very difficult. And despite the bandwidth challenges, we do try and encourage people to keep their videos on at all times. I don't know if that's a rule for FMCS, but if you start seeing people switching off their cameras, it does raise questions about whether they're actually going to be paying attention. And when you have key interlocutors who are not fully engaged, then it starts to raise questions about, are we going to have to go back to this point? Are we actually going to be able to move this thing forward because we just don't see and we don't know? And then that human interaction piece that is missing when you can't read the body language, when you can't send a couple people for a cup of coffee for, a half hour to hash something out, when you're not on mission actually bringing these people together and having meals together, having beers afterwards, and being able to kind of, rehash a little bit what's been done and just sort of build those personal relationships, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more in the throughout the panel. Thanks,
Chris. It's actually a perfect segue onto the next question that I'm hoping, Antoinette, you can start us off with. You all three of you have mentioned some aspect, I think, of trust, either trust in the system or trust between the parties, and some of the unique challenges that the past year has brought with respect to that. So, in addition to the technology itself, what have been some of your strategies, Antoinette, for dealing and building that trust when you can't necessarily be there in person?
Some of the things, Kevin had touched on, some of the main things that we've done that I thought was really helpful, because it was so new to everyone. We would get the parties, like I said, we would do test runs, but I think the training aspect of it was a major help, and it built the trust. And I always would try to get the parties to do the trainings together, labor and management to do the trainings together, so we can try to build the trust together and learn the platform together so that they can ask the questions together. We can answer the questions together, learn the technique together and any of the kinks that may occur. That way they can ask all the same questions, because a lot of times they would be wondering the same things, right? And they can get all the answers at the same time. So that was a major help when we were able to do them together. But if they didn't feel comfortable, whatever made them feel more comfortable is how we would do it. If they didn't feel comfortable doing them together, then no problem. We would do them separately. That wasn't an issue. But whatever we could do to help them feel more comfortable, we would do that as well. As I indicated, we would have our technicians, which would walk them through the process. Once they saw that it wasn't just a mediator, our technical parties were also mediators, which was bound to the same confidentiality that we're bound to, which made them feel more comfortable as well. They had that same level of trust with them, so they knew that whatever was discussed had the same confidentiality. We also had agreement forms, the same type of agreement forms that had to be signed prior to any of our mediations were also done before any virtual mediation would take place. We would send it to them prior for them to review it. Some of them had to be signed, some didn't have to be signed. So for collective bargaining mediations or trainings, some trainings, they did not have to be signed, but they were terms and conditions that had to be read prior to, which talked about no recordings, no saving of audio equipments. All of that was listed prior. So they would read it, we would make sure they understood it, we would talk about it. And that also helped to build the trust as well. So those were different things that we used to help them to feel the trust. The breakout rooms, we played a lot with those, and just so that they felt really good when they were in the breakout rooms, they actually liked it. It was like, wow, this is neat. It's like being in a different room, and nobody else can hear. It was like, nope, only you and I or whoever's in this room. And because we were the only ones that can control it, they really felt like it was very trustworthy. They didn't feel like anybody else can hear what was going on, and they really trust that process. So the more and more we got familiar with all the different platforms, I would say the parties also started getting familiar with it, because not only were they working with it with us, but they started beginning to work with it, I believe, within their own agencies or their own companies. So by more and more, when they started working more with us, they began to feel more comfortable, because they realized that this is the way of the world now. So not only are we doing it with you all at FMCS, we're now starting to do it more and more in our own agencies or our own organizations. So they started helping us as well. Some of the other techniques that we would use in training with the different platforms, as I indicated, and as Chris stated, with the different trainings, I think the trainings were the most beneficial things that was helping to build the trust between the parties, especially if they was doing them jointly. That was the main focus. I think that was our number one. I think that was the number one building of the trust, was having them all do it together. So I think that was the best part for me, was helping them when they were all together, building that trust. They were asking the same questions, and then they realized that they were all feeling the exact same way. So and it worked out tremendously when they were all doing it together. So that was some of the strategies I used.
That's really interesting, Antoinette, and kind of a unique opportunity, right? Because if you were doing it in person, there's a limited number of things that you can train both sides on together without them feeling like it's fake or not really necessary. But this is, you know, team building built into actually a skill that they both need. So I think that's a really interesting strategy. Chris, what about internationally? Have you seen similar challenges in building trust? What have been some of the biggest concerns or strategies for dealing with it?
I mean, you could do an entire panel just on building trust with parties coming from different backgrounds in different countries and different cultures. I was very fortunate to have facilitated a discussion throughout 2018 and 19, which led to, and I'm going to focus on a country that's very dear to my heart and is going through a very difficult time right now, Myanmar, Burma. I was fortunate to help facilitate a negotiation that took place, a rather historic negotiation between the Industrial Workers Federation of Myanmar and a group of supplier factories in the garment industry that were supplying for brands that were part of this process called ACT, Action, Collaboration, Transformation. It's an international partnership that brings together about 20-some brands. And the factories themselves represented, I think, about 40-some% of the export volume coming out of Myanmar. And what we started offline. We actually got the first agreement, which was called the Freedom of Association Guidelines in late 2019. And we were continuing negotiations into 2020 when everything kicked off. I had to cancel my last mission because of we were all grounded for COVID. But I can say, I mean, the challenges of bringing people together from different backgrounds, different expectations. We had factory managers who were coming from China who had a particular view of what freedom of association is and isn't, and taking them through a process of how to engage with a group of trade unionists from Myanmar, with brand representatives in the room, without trying to have it seem to be too much forcing a particular view, but actually bringing the parties through a process was very, very interesting. And what I would say is one of the most important things that helped us to even go beyond what I had expected in the development of the dispute resolution mechanism, et cetera, was the relationships that had been built. And I would say, you know, one of the key learnings for me was to be able to rely on the pre-existing relationships that had been built in the previous processes. Oftentimes when you're dealing with whether it's a mediation or a negotiation or some other facilitation process, the people who are in the room have a history, for good or for bad. But if they've actually been able to engage in a way that works, in a way that actually has built that trust, well, then you can actually rely on that as you move into this sort of online realm. And here we saw they actually went from these guidelines and built the relationship that they had built through the process of developing these guidelines, then allowed them to actually negotiate completely online this joint framework to protect the health and welfare of workers and support the payment of both workers and factories in Myanmar. So they actually were able to turn that thing around and look at where they actually had generated momentum and trust between the factories and the trade union, the IWFM, and it actually helped them to develop further guidelines. They've developed a fast-track dispute resolution mechanism, which, as I understand it, is still being used despite the really challenging situation that they're facing following the military coup in February.
Thanks, Chris. No, that's really interesting to think about building on negotiations that have already started and sort of that bank of trust that you might already have. Kevin, I wonder if you've seen similar things with respect to trust, how you've built it, or even a situation where it's completely new. And what do you do to help build trust when you don't have that history of trust built up already?
Well, I would say that to echo what's been said is that, you know, just to get parties together ahead of time and you have them hear the same thing, and if anything, you're giving them a preview of how to work through their issues because you have the online mediation process. And if they can figure out how to get on and share documents and get, unmute themselves and put themselves in the caucuses, it's almost like they've come to an agreement on how to actually figure out the process. So it's good training wheels for the actual negotiation. So I have seen that. But I mean, the best example I can think of is my first example, which I've said probably ad nauseum to a lot of people. But right when the pandemic hit, as I mentioned, I'd never done virtual mediation. I knew we had Ring Central, and what happened was there was going to be a ground rules negotiation between the Department of Defense and the teachers union, and they had not had collective bargaining in over 20 years. So they had basically run their labor relations through a series of patched together MOUs over 25 years. And prior to the pandemic, the agency said, hey, we should get together and do collective bargaining. So we actually have a collective bargaining agreement. So, you know, the union was at the time, before, this is all pre-COVID, they were very hesitant, were fearful of what was going to be implemented in the new collective bargaining agreement. And I had several conversations on the phone with both sides, and we were setting up times to meet in Washington, D.C. at a neutral place, and getting all that ready in the beginning of February of 2020. So if you fast forward to that middle of March timeframe, we were scheduled to meet on the 16th of March. And what happened was the teachers, their lead negotiator was in Washington, and they had a teacher from Italy and a teacher, I think she was from Morocco. They had flown into DC a few days before because this was a big deal. They were going to negotiate ground rules to set the stage for collective bargaining, first time in 25 years. And then COVID hits. The Department of Defense says, we're not authorized to travel. So we're not going to DC because this is not mission critical in its ground rules, and we're happy to negotiate. And so that whole weekend, I was having conversation with both sides, basically talking to them. Well, what can we do? Well, we have this Ring Central platform, which I had never done, but I'll figure it out. And that's part of the message I would say to anybody is try to do whatever it takes to get the parties to talk to each other, and by whatever means necessary. So I said, look, we have Ring Central. We can try to do it this way. Department of Defense is not coming to meet in person. Why don't we give it a try? And the union was dead set against doing it. They said, we flew 2 people in from across the world, and we're going to do it in person. And I said, well, that, you know, and having back, this is several conversations. Well, why don't we at least try? Because you're not going to get them to come downtown. Why don't we at least try to do this virtually? And I've never done this either. Be patient with me, and let's try to do it. So they eventually, after about 3 or 4 phone calls, they reluctantly agreed. I think their words were, under protest, we will do it. So they were in their conference room that they were in. I had the people from the Defense Department. For some reason, which I didn't know, they allowed it to be downloaded. Thank goodness, because I had no other experience with any other platforms. Got them all on. We spent half of that was the first time we ever done a virtual mediation, any of us. So we spent a good hour, how to share documents, how to get on, all those sort of things, and everyone was able to get on. And that was like, wow, this is pretty interesting. So we agreed to do those negotiations for the week. And after the 3rd day or 2nd day, because of COVID, the teachers who were in a hotel room, the hotel was shut down, and we had to stop the negotiation because they weren't able to go into the hotel room. So we had to stop the negotiations, and we agreed 6 weeks later to pick it up. And those 2 teachers were stuck in America for about a month before they could get home. So we got back maybe in May, but everyone had gotten on, and that reluctance to do online or virtual mediation kind of subsided because they actually saw how it worked. And to kind of cut to the chase, we spent probably 6 weeks over the next however many months working together. They became whizzes at Ring Central, shared information, documents, got through it. In their ground rules, they actually agreed to 1/3 of their negotiations to be online. The other would be, you know, over in Europe, the other 1/3 in DC. They also learned that would save a ton of money for both sides. So they were happy to do it that way. And they knew there was a big scary thing out there. And the parties, instead of being so distrustful of each other in the beginning, they worked really well together. And it was very satisfying to see them finally get an agreement after many, many, many months. But That's the best example I have. It's the first example. There's many others, but that's like they were dead set against, the union was dead set against meeting virtually. 100% didn't want to do it. You just, well, that's all we can do. They're not going to be able to go there. So that's the best example I have.
That's a great example, and totally rich content from everything. Like you can't meet in person, but it happened right at the beginning and then continued throughout. To that end, thinking about more examples, Chris and Antoinette, I'd like to hear both from you if you have some examples to share, either on direct collective bargaining, mediation, or Chris, perhaps even social dialogue around COVID-19, what you've seen there of some solutions that have been successful, and Antoinette, other examples of success that you've seen, and what were the factors that got to success? Because I think that can be instructive for us all as we think about it going forward. So Chris, maybe I'll start with you, and then Antoinette, I'll turn to you.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to jump right into successes and paint too rosy of a picture, because I think that we all have seen and experienced just how enormous the COVID crisis has been in the United States, but globally as well. And we're continuing to see new waves and new variants coming up. The ILO's just recently come out with some new figures. I thought I would share one or two just for everybody's information. And most recent, published just last week, the World Employment and Social Outcome Trends for 2021, where we're actually saying that in 2020, 8.8% of the total working hours globally have been lost. That's equal to about 255 million full-time jobs. I mean, that's absolutely enormous. Half of that was related to working hour losses. So people actually working reduced working time, but still working. But then half of those numbers was due to actual employment losses. And this has obviously led to a sharp drop in labor income, an increase in poverty. If you're interested in that information, I'm not going to take any more of your time, but I can put in the chat a link to the WASO trends that have just been published, and you can have a look at that. But what we have found is that both tripartite, government, employers, and workers working together, and bipartite, worker-employer negotiated solutions, have been able to deliver in addressing some of these things, in addressing issues related to, health and safety in the workplace, safe resumption of economic activity, income losses, flexible working time and flexible work organizations so that workers can actually maintain their jobs, etc. We've seen in a study that we published last year, we looked very carefully at a number of examples across the world. And we saw there was a lot of examples of where sort of negotiated solutions between workers and employers were actually supported by governments, either through social protection systems or even through the president's office in some cases, to create and promulgate decrees, presidential decrees, that helped to concretize what had been negotiated between the bipartite partners by the workers and the employers organizations, and extend that to workers in the countries. So we gave examples from Uruguay for self-employed workers. We gave example from Tunisia, which could have some really interesting impacts for 1.5 million workers' salaries during the first lockdown. And a really interesting example in South Africa, where the National Bargaining Council in the clothing manufacturing industry actually combined collective bargaining, a collective unemployment claim with an employer contribution, which was brought through a collective bargaining agreement, whereby workers received 100% of their pay for the 6-week lockdown that they went through in the first wave. And that collective agreement was recognized to be a good practice, and the government actually extended that. The government used their legal authority to extend the terms of that collective agreement, something that we don't know that much about in the US, but to cover some 80,000 workers across the garment industry. We saw biosecurity protocols, so real efforts to ensure OSH, social distancing, PPE, the provision, and hygiene measures enforced, including in places like Colombia and the banana plantations in Colombia. This was dealt with through collective bargaining after a number of industrial disputes. I think it's really, really interesting to look at the case of Italy, which we delve into in some detail in the study. And there we really look at the value in the articulation, the relationship between things happening at different levels. So in Italy, for instance, you had a national tripartite agreement. You had the National Confederation, sort of the AFL-CIO on the union side. I guess it would be the Chamber of Commerce, the USCIB on the employer's side, and the government actually sitting down together and reaching agreement, which led to a presidential decree on how we're going to manage the COVID crisis. This led to a bipartite OSH protocol dealing specifically with safety and health protocols, helped shape policy, and was actually appended to the presidential decree by the government. This also helped to guide sector-specific collective agreements in almost every single sector in Italy. And they created these tailored responses, sector by sector, industry by industry, dealing with the specific nature of work organization, the specific impacts that were happening, if these were sectors where you had a lot of frontline workers or where you had a lot of people who were laid off or put on leave, etc. And then you had enterprise agreements, including in those enterprises where there had been strikes related to COVID. So you had OSH, work organization, and also the agreements reflected the enterprise committees, which, going back to the original presidential decree following tripartite dialogue, actually put in place these enterprise committees that were established by the decree. We also look at things like, supporting business solvency, retaining jobs, securing incomes, as I've mentioned already, through different short-time work schemes, wage moderation measures, the creative use of leave and teleworking arrangements, etc. And this is not something where we just looked at sort of North America and Europe. We were really looking at examples from all around the world. And we found that there are actually a large number of interesting cases where pre-existing trust and mechanisms for dialogue were particularly helpful in taking these tailored, measured, and very effective responses to COVID in a number of different areas, again, from income security, work organization, and more flexible work arrangements, reskilling, cross-skilling. Interestingly, in those countries where you had industry-wide collective bargaining agreements, you also were able to find cases where you had sort of intra or inter-company mobility. If there's one company that was going to be having to lay people off, there could be the possibility, given that the terms and conditions would be the same because of an industry-wide agreement, there were possibilities of actually having those workers go to another company within the same sector. So we found some really interesting creative solutions that were really based on dialogue and the commitment from the social partners and the government to make it work.
Thanks, Chris. And if you can put the links in the chat, I think that would be helpful. And we can also upload the two papers that you talked about onto the conference site. Antoinette, I'd like to hear from you too. Some examples, and I'll take Chris's point. We shouldn't only look on the positive side. So examples either of success or of really highlighting the ongoing challenges that we're facing.
Well, with FMCS, we've had some pretty positive things come out of this. First of all, our numbers have increased, actually, our workload. We've been able to continuously help our parties. Our case numbers have gone up. We've been able to help even more of our parties with their issues. Also with their trainings or facilitated dialogues, we've been able to help more of those. We also have our skills development trainings that we've been able to help with. We've also been able to, if there's been special high profile cases that have needed, maybe we've had a couple of high profile cases that we had to get special permission maybe for in-person mediations. We were able to get that approved. So we, throughout this whole process, we were able to continue to be able to offer our services and do more outreaches throughout this process. So we weren't really looking for the challenges. I think our agency are out there to mainly to help people that may be having the challenges. So we're mostly out there to try to help the service and help people that are going through those issues. So that's primarily our goal. So we're there to help service those issues, and we have maintained, if not excelled, some of those numbers. So I think we've been pretty proud as an agency of what we were able to continue to do throughout this pandemic. So I know Kevin and I have been busy in the DC area, and not only in the DC area, but because we've been virtual, we're able to help our colleagues in other areas. So we've been able to do work, not just in the DC area, but in other areas of the United States. So it's been great. We've been able to do outreaches in other areas. So we've been still pretty busy. So it's been good. As I indicated, we were able to continue keeping our clients serviced, and we maintain our numbers, keeping really busy. Also, not just with doing mediations, but also our other services that we offer with our training. So we've been pretty busy.
It's really interesting, Antoinette, that the numbers have gone up in some cases as well, talking about the need for this discussion and dialogue to still take place, no matter the challenges. So I do know that we have a number of experts on the line too. So I want to give a chance for anyone that has a question for our panel to feel free to either type it in the chat or raise your digital hand or just unmute if you want to ask it now before we get to sort of closing thoughts on what's going forward. So did anyone have a question that they wanted to ask or a thing that they wanted to talk about? I can also pause. I promise I won't call on people directly from the audience, even though names that I recognize. Okay, well, keep thinking about it and feel free to again, either raise your digital hand or type it in the chat. Okay, Zach, I see your question here. Well, good. This is actually what we plan to talk about next. So Zach, we're on the same page. Should parties or will they continue to use digital in the future, even when in person is back? So I think this is sort of what we wanted to reflect on towards the end as well. Like, what's going to stick around? What will we see going forward? Is it going to go back to sort of business as normal beforehand, or hybrid, or different things? Maybe Antoinette, if you want to start.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of virtual work. A lot of agencies and organizations have realized that they've been able to save quite a bit of money. So I think that they will most likely continue to do a lot of things virtually where they can save money in travel. I think they realize now that they probably don't have to have as much office space. So I think we'll probably still see a lot of telework going on where it can continue to take place. Yeah, I think this virtual world will continue to stay around a lot longer where it can. Yes, absolutely. It's a lot of cost savings.
Thanks, Antoinette. And Kevin, what are your thoughts? What will we see sticking around, and what won't we see sticking around, or what will change?
Well, I do think it'll be some sort of hybrid. I mean, people will want to meet in person, but as Antoinette mentioned, if I had $1 every time someone said, wow, my boss, agency, union, etc., are never going to have me fly to Cleveland from DC just to do this for one day. We can do a lot of the work virtually, the cost saving. But in collective bargaining, I could see situations where, let's say, they're negotiating over a number of weeks. Maybe on the front end, they do the beginning work virtually, and then maybe evolve more into in person as they get closer to the end. I do think people are going to want to do things in person, but we can collaborate all across the country, as Antoinette said. So I could help out with things on the West Coast, which I wasn't able to do before, or I may have been able to do, but it would have been very expensive to fly all the way across the country. And I can just sit here and open my laptop and help out. But there's going to be, we've had a presidential election, which has switched things around and the dynamics. That has an effect. And then there's always going to be conflict, whether you're virtual or not. And collective bargaining has successes and failures, whether you're virtual or not. And it's not because of the platform. It's just the nature of what we do. So, I think there'll be some sort of hybrid. If you had told me over a year ago that we'd be busier than we were prior, I would never have believed it. I would have said, nah, people don't want to do this at all. But I was proved wrong for sure, because we're just as busy or more busy than we were before. And more people now are coming back to work, and that's a whole other layer of negotiations, which we're seeing, what's parking going to look like? Do we have to be in person? Do we have to do this? Like there's a whole new thing we're going to have to talk about. And I'm starting to see that.
Thanks, Kevin. And Chris, what are your thoughts? What's going to stick around?
I mean, I think it was always going to be a challenge, but prior to COVID kind of pushing us into this new reality, I think it was always a challenge to figure out the best mix of what you can do face-to-face and what you can do in person. And coming from the ILO, I mean, there are plenty of examples where I was more than happy to even come in for a 20-minute presentation into a session like this, or, even an hour discussion without having to actually, leave with all of the, not only cost, but also the, the upheaval that involves in preparing for the mission and the travel, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're talking about working not just within a country, but internationally, it is something that we had been giving a lot of thought about in the ILO previously. But I think that we've now been pushed into this situation where this is, I don't want to say new normal because it seems a bit cliche these days, but I mean, this has been proven to be an effective way of communication. So I don't think it's going to be something where there's not going to be any more scope for or need for or appetite for face-to-face. I think the more you get involved in sort of the nitty-gritty of negotiations, the more that having the face-to-face contact is really important. But I think at the same time, there is going to be this possibility of using a kind of a blended approach, whether it be in preparation for and between face-to-face sessions of a negotiation, or even in a training environment. In the ILO, we've developed a number of training materials so that we could continue to deliver our program and our work in the context of COVID, where everybody's at home. I remember having one gentleman in Southern Africa. He was actually participating in an academy where we were doing all of these things online using a blended system of sort of Zoom meetings, but also these self-directed, self-guided learning modules. And he was participating in an entire day session while he was on a bus traveling from one place to another. And I think the ability to do that, the facility to be able to do that nowadays with mobile technology, et cetera, makes it such that obviously we're going to be making use of that more and more. And I think we also have to recognize this is something that had been getting more and more used. It just now we're in a situation where we were forced into it, and we've been able to actually see that it absolutely is able to, it is something that's possible in the long term. But yeah, if I had to guess, it'd really be something that would be kind of blended, adapted as needed, like, what objectives you're trying to get at, what makes the most sense from the interpersonal considerations versus, the cost considerations and everything.
Thanks, Chris. Looking again at Zach's question, I think the should is interesting to me. And Antoinette, I want to pick up on what you said, that it's going to be hard to argue from a cost perspective that you need to be in person. I mean, it's hard to predict, but what do you think? Is it going to be, are you going to have to advocate more to say, look, this is really, if we can be in person, we need to be in person, and here's why? Given that the digital is so much more familiar now.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a long discussion for some parties. They're going to have to really be able to convince the other side of why it's important to be face-to-face when it's been proven that it can be done virtually, and it has shown that it's a major cost saving. So if yeah, they're going to have to be able to show if one side is saying no, they don't want to come face to face because of the cost savings, and the other party is saying, but we still think it's very important that we want to come face to face, then as from a mediator's perspective, as a mediator, we would try to have them, start thinking more creative and maybe say, well, maybe you can do some face-to-face and do some virtually and try to see if we can come to a win-win that way. There's different ways of, thinking creatively and trying to see if both parties can try to please each other, and trying to maybe meet sometimes in person and sometimes virtually, and sometimes it can work that way. But it's going to be a long discussion and a hard discussion and a very serious discussion. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thinking about all of the discussions coming up, that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
How that pans out.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So just we have only a couple minutes left, but two questions, Chris. So maybe the first very quickly to you, just on the dynamics, particularly at the beginning and now going forward on negotiations with respect to order cancellation or social security safety net protection for workers that were in some of the factories where where orders were canceled, and what that looks like. And then Kevin and Antoinette, if I can ask you to come back in right at the end on just an assessment, has dialogue been more open or less open with virtual, or both? So we'll close with those two questions. We do only have 2 minutes. So Chris, 1 minute on that, and then maybe you can put some additional resources in the chat, and then Kevin and Antoinette.
You want me to answer 1 minute on the power dynamic between the global North brands and global South suppliers?
I'm confident you can do it though.
All right, it's a challenge that's been there for many years and will continue to be, and it was definitely exacerbated during COVID. The ILO has been following this very closely and has been engaging with brands, with development partners, with employers organizations and trade unions and governments within a variety of different garment producing countries to speak to whether the power has shifted even more. I think what you saw here was a clear indication of where these businesses actually had power and exercised that power, and where pushing back was something that wasn't it wasn't something that many supplier factories were necessarily willing to do. And it also shown a spotlight, and I'll stop after this, on the serious limitations of social protection systems in those countries where brands are making choices to produce in the garment industry.
Thanks, Chris. I know it was tough in 60 seconds, but I appreciate it. Kevin and Antoinette, thoughts on the dialogue question, more or less open in digital?
I'll give my favorite answer to anything related to mediation. I was waiting for this. It depends. So that's my favorite answer. Sometimes parties are more open because it's virtually. Sometimes they're less, but I'll give a very quick example as doing a negotiation, and it was in a huge Zoom type meeting where there were 30 people on the line, and you could tell that people were withholding information. They didn't want to collaborate, talk, etc. And I took a separate caucus with just the two lead negotiators and said, this isn't working, right? This is just me. They agreed to that and said, this is never going to work with 30 different people on a Zoom call. So why don't we get back, when we get back together tomorrow, you can keep a separate meeting, keep all the rest of the folks there, keep them up to date, and then do a smaller group of maybe 3 on each side, and then we can work through it. And that worked much better because it was just so hard to manage everyone on a screen like that.
Thanks, Kevin. And Antoinette, final word to you.
Did not really have too much problems with dialogue. They continued to talk, whether it was good or bad. Dialogue continued, whether they were happy. they told how they felt, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Whether it was a good dialogue or bad dialogue, they continued to dialogue. So it was good either way.
And that's some of the most important things. And actually, I will actually give the final word to Eileen. Eileen Hoffman from FMCS. If you want to say,
I am so pleased. It's wonderful when you're part of a program and it can run by itself. I want to thank Sarah, our folks from the ILO, Antoinette and Kevin, for their unique insights into what's going to be, I think, a part of the collective bargaining scene. And I want to thank the audience for their insights and questions, and to tell them that FMCS is trying to be as flexible as possible, both in its training and in its ability to work with the parties. And as you can see from both what Antoinette and Kevin said, we're mostly, I call us chameleon mediators. We try to be as adaptable as possible. And I think the pandemic has been a big challenge for us. And I want to thank Sarah for chairing this. And we've had a number of meetings in advance, so you can see this could run itself. And I'm sure each person in the audience has some key views. And I hope this conversation can continue, perhaps not at this hour, but further on. Thank you very much, everyone.
great. Thanks, Eileen. And excellent last words. So thanks everyone for joining. We really appreciate the discussion. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the LERA program over the next coming days. So thanks very much.
Take care. Thanks.